Hello! Today I wanted to do a different format. The question we'll be answering is why Indians like Russia. Why is this question important to answer? Well, on the one level, at both the popular level and the elite level, people in Europe don't understand why India is close with Russia. So I want to delve into this relationship today. On another level, even people in India, while many of them think fondly of Russia and Russians, don't really articulate this relationship fully when speaking with people in the West. Now, there are many layers to this relationship that I want to dig into today. So, we're going to go through this relationship, where it is now, where it came from, why there are so many layers, and in doing so, you'll get a better understanding of why the India-Russia relationship is so strong. All right, let's dig into it. So the first thing to answer is it really strong? Well, the answer is yes. The India-Russia relationship is very strong. It's strong not just at the popular level, but also at the elite level. So this is a multi-layered relationship that we have between India and Russia. So on the one side, I'll urge you to look at how Vladimir Putin is treated in India versus how Trump or Ursula von der Leyen from the EU or Xi Jinping is treated in India. Now, of course, these being state visits, they're all cordial, they're all friendly, but the nature of these visits is different each and every time. Look, for example, at how Modi and Putin ride in the same car at the SCO. This is not something that really happens in such a natural way between Narendra Modi and any other leader. When an American president visits India, it usually has a showy element about it. Like, look at India, look at what you can get from this relationship. But the warmth isn't really there. It's more of an entertainment relationship. In the way that it's shown, I mean. When the EU visits India, it has a bureaucratic flavor to it. Yes, there's friendliness, there's cordiality, there's necessity. And I think the two sides get along quite well. But there isn't that, what's the word I'm looking for? Chumminess, bro side to the relationship that you get with the India-Russia relationship. Look at the pomp with which Putin was received in Delhi in December 2025 and compare this to the other leaders who I mentioned. Forget about China. When Xi Jinping visits India, it's cordial again and friendly, but in a very cold way, because these countries are somewhat adversaries, and so there's a cold, calculated nature to the relationship and even to the interactions between Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping. This is not the case with the Russians. But this isn't only on the elite level. You see this also at the popular level. If you look at a Pew survey here, for example, you see that Indians are especially positive on Russia, on Putin, and even on geopolitical matters like maintaining access to Russian energy. For example, 59% of Indians have confidence in Vladimir Putin, whereas the 23-country median is only 12%. So Indians at all levels generally very favorable towards Russians. And what we're going to dig into is why. So on the one hand, there's a very ancient layer to this relationship. Now, in everything I'm going to say, it's not that I think this is necessarily the most important thing. I'm just saying that this is something that people in both countries speak about these elements as important. So there's a gene called the R1A1A gene. It's a genetic marker on the Y DNA, which is a paternal haplogroup. And this comes from the Yamnaya people, or in other words, the Sintashta culture. This is a group that originates in southern Russia, in the southern Urals, in roughly 2100 BCE. And these are the people who created the first spoked wheeled chariots. They're also the people who more or less invented long distance horse riding. So their impact can be felt throughout Eurasia, as you can see in this map, because their genes spread, mostly male driven. That's why it's a paternal haplogroup. We're not going to talk about the implications of that in this video, but as you can imagine, a male-driven migration expansion is not always peaceful. That being said, these people who spread from southern Russia to India, to Eastern Europe, and you can see the mild patterns of their influence felt even in Central Europe and in other parts of the world, like in the Arabian Peninsula. You can see that their culture shares a lot of elements with especially North Indian Sanskrit-based culture. So for example, they have common words. You've got the word for water, udaka, in Russian voda, which becomes vodka. You've got fire, Agni, in Russian ogon, mother, matra, Russian mat. You've even got knowledge, jnana, Russian znani. I've put a little Google Maps image of how they might have walked over. It looks like it would only take 818 hours if you walked it in one stretch. Not too bad, actually. Though, of course, they didn't walk it in one stretch. They would have zigzagged, migrated to different places on the way. Iran, for example, has high amounts of these people's DNA and cultural elements as well. You even have mythological parallels. So the Russians no longer follow openly their ancient Slavic traditions, but there is a pagan element to Russian Christianity that isn't really there in Western European Christianity, especially not Protestant Christianity. And this is because the ancient peoples of Russia and the Vedic peoples of India have similar deities that were probably the same deities way back in the day when they started emigrating. For example, Indra, we can see Indra in this bronze statue down here, and Perun, who we can see in this stone carving up here. These are both the father god of these traditions and are associated with thunder and war. Now I have a couple of book recommendations. One of them is Gods, Guns, and Missionaries by Manu Pillai, where he looks at how the Vedic religions, when they first came to India, took on the job of stitching together the various Indian folk religions. And this is how we end up with Hinduism. And that's why Hinduism is now very different from that ancient Vedic tradition, and also very different from Slavic pagan traditions and Zoroastrianism, for example. And the second book recommendation is Wanderers, Kings, and Merchants by Peggy Mohan. In this book, she talks about how Sanskrit, when it first came to India, was quite different from how the language ended up, because it then absorbed elements of Indian languages, and how many Indian languages were also influenced by Sanskrit. So that's a great book. And it helps paint a picture of the journey of these peoples, the Sintashta people or the R1A genetic marker people, as they moved through the Eurasian steppe and into India. And one last book recommendation is First Indians by Tony Joseph, and that is a genetic study of India, where he looks at what the genetic makeup of the Indian people are, and he does cover this R1A gene, and I think he speaks of them as the Yamnaya or the Arya people. By the way, when I say Arya people, if there's anyone European watching this or Western, you might freak out like, Aryans, that's what that mean guy from Germany said. but this is actually a scientific concept of the people who originated in the southern Urals. So that mean guy from Germany was actually wrong. He thought they were like Nordics or something. But these are just a very mixed genetic group of people who start from the southern Urals, who invent horse riding over long distances and spoked wheeled chariots, and then they essentially spread all over the world, including to Germany, as you can see here. So that book, First Indians by Tony Joseph is fantastic. So there's some quotes about this ancient connection between Russia and India. Here's one from Rabindranath Tagore. If you haven't heard of him, if you're Indian, you've for sure heard of him, but if you're not Indian, he is an intellectual giant from India, the first Asian to ever win the Nobel Prize in Literature. He also wrote India's national anthem. He wrote a bunch of books. He wrote poetry. He was a thinker on history and geopolitics. He was a towering figure in South Asia's history overall. He wrote Bangladesh's national anthem too, by the way. He says, in Russia, as in India, there is a deep sense of the communal soul. The Russian peasant and the Indian farmer are brothers in their connection to the land and the spirit. Then we have Nicholas Roerich, Russian painter and philosopher who spent some of his time in India. He says, the Russian heart has always been drawn to India. It's not the only Russian thing that's been drawn to India, but I'll cover that in just a moment. There's a secret tie between the Russian soul and the great wisdom of the East. We are the two wings of the same great bird of Eurasia. So that was Nicholas Roerich. And then even coming to the modern day, Indians and Russians invoke this. By the way, Tagore and Roerich were writing this in the early 1900s. Roerich, I think, in 1905, and Tagore a few years later. But even coming to today, Vladimir Putin says, India is a great power. It is a unique civilization. We are not just partners, we are two poles of a multipolar world that share ancient roots in the Eurasian space. So he's invoking this ancient connection, right? Which is what elites from multiple countries do. In the US and Europe, they talk about their shared culture and history. The Arabs talk about this with other Arab-speaking peoples around the world. Africans speak about this with the African diaspora in the United States. Human beings are storytellers by nature. We build stories, and that's how we connect with each other and how we do great things, right? Yuval Noah Harari talks about this in his Sapiens book. And so this is the story that India and Russia use to tie themselves together in this ancient past. Then we have India's independence struggle and the colonial era. So this is about the 1800s to 1947. The British Empire, which controlled the world's oceans and controlled India as well, played something called The Great Game. Another book recommendation is The Great Game by, who was The Great Game by? I forget the name of the author, but if you look it up, the most famous book of the name, The Great Game, you can read about the competition between the British Empire, which controlled the world's oceans, but most importantly the Indian Ocean, because India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and Tsarist Russia, which, as you can see on this map here in the orange, is pushing down past Kazakhstan. So when I said earlier that that's not the only thing that Russia was drawn to in India, Russia has always been drawn to the Indian Ocean because Russia is otherwise trapped. On the western side of Russia, you have the great European powers who have made it their life's mission to never let Russia reach the Atlantic Ocean. On the eastern side, you have Japan, which literally forms a wall against Russia's expansion east into the Pacific Ocean. And the Russians have always thought if they can just push south far enough, they can get access to the Indian Ocean. and a warm water port from where they can project power and trade with the world. Now, at this time, the Russians were gradually making inroads into the Karakoram Mountains and into Afghanistan. And so the British and the Russians, they have a spy battle in the mountains, right? The Great Game, fantastic period of history. Now, as we move into the early 1900s, the Russians have their revolution in 1917, and it's only 30 years later that India would have its independence. And so Indian leaders took inspiration from the Russians' ability to resist tyranny. Nehru visited Moscow in 1927, 20 years before India got independence, and he praised the Soviet Union. Now, he wrote this book, The Discovery of India, in 1946. And I recommend this book as well. When I first read this book, I was surprised by how far-sighted it is. I know that a lot of people like to criticize Nehru in India, especially from India's BJP-leaning factions. I criticize Nehru as well in some ways. But if you read this book, you'll see that many of the things that he wrote in here are something that I would expect someone to write in 2026. And it's very surprising that people were thinking this way in 1946. Let's read some of it. The Soviet Union, despite many mistakes, has a message of hope for the world. In some ways, it is the most advanced country in the world, but there is the danger of individual freedom being crushed by centralization. He wrote on the USA, America has vitality and efficiency, but the spirit of their capitalism is a narrow and limited one. It leads to a new kind of imperialism, the dollar imperialism. So this is like straight out of YouTube 2026, and this guy's writing this in 1946, India's first prime minister. It's funny that he's kind of just calling America shallow, right? Their capitalism is a narrow and limited one. It's like, okay. So India takes inspiration from the Soviets until independence. Now, right after independence, Stalin and the Soviet Union were initially cold towards India because India didn't go full communist, right? The Russians were like a pushy teenage boyfriend that was like, we either go all the way or we're breaking up. And India was like, I just want to be a socialist democracy. And the Russians weren't that happy about that. So initially, when India had a famine, the Russians, the Soviets, refused food aid to India. And the USA provided it. These were early days after World War II, when people were still trying to figure out who is whose friend. Then, in 1954, Pakistan and the US seal an alliance. Two alliances, actually. SEATO and CENTO. They're like NATO, but for Southeast Asia and Central Asia. Why did this happen? It's because when India got independence, the British more or less created Pakistan. They encouraged its creation, at least, so that they could get a foothold to continue playing the Great Game in Central Asia, because they thought they were still going to be a superpower. Gradually, the British retreat from this superpower position, but the United States fills this role as the Cold War begins between them and the Soviets. And Pakistan knew it was smaller than India. It knew it was weak. It was deliberately created to be weak so that it has to depend on outside powers. And their leaders went to the United States to become a lady of the night, if you will. They said, look, we'll give you whatever you want. We'll be an ally of the West. They called themselves a martial race. We'll be good soldiers for the West. Just help. So the United States said, okay, let's do it. And India was obviously pissed about this, right? And so India and the Soviets naturally grow closer. In 1955, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev visits India and he backs India's claim on Kashmir, which, remember, Pakistan invaded in, I think it was 1948, with a group of tribals, and they committed unspeakable savagery on the people there. And Khrushchev says, just over the mountains, you have a friend. If you ever call us from the mountaintops, we will be there. So this is the beginning of what you could say is this very friendly period between the Soviets and India. I've put a couple of cute pictures of Khrushchev's visit to Srinagar in 1955. You can see that they're like feeding each other. He's being paraded around. So again, when I spoke about this element earlier of how friendly Russian dignitaries visiting India, how friendly the treatment is, this goes way back, right, to at least back to 1955. All right, and then we have the Sino-Soviet split. Now, China invades Tibet in 1954 or 1959. They completed in 1959. The Dalai Lama flees to India, and India hosts him, which China hates because they think of him as a terrorist, right? And the Soviets remained neutral in the 1962 war. In fact, I would even say they leaned towards India because they provided India with MiG-21 jet technology for India to make those in India itself. And they refused that technology to China. Mao Zedong was pissed. He said the Soviet Union is providing the Indian reactionaries with planes and tanks to kill Chinese people. He was pissed. And this starts a larger split between the Chinese and the Soviets, which gets much worse over time. They'll fight a little war in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, over an island in northern China. And this is kind of the beginning of when they split, because they're like, hey, I thought we were communist bros, and now, you've broken the rule. Bros before the bourgeoisie hose. I don't know. China was angry. And this India-Soviet relationship becomes even deeper, right? So the Soviets and China fight their little war in 1969. China then warms up to the United States. And all of these geopolitical configurations are changing. Then in 1971, West Pakistan starts a genocide in East Pakistan because East Pakistan, what is today Bangladesh, won an election, and West Pakistan, being fairer skinned and more Persianized, right? They like that they're closer to their Persian, what they think of as their Persian roots. They were pissed that Bangladesh, what is then East Pakistan, won the election and would have had the prime ministership of Pakistan. And so they send the army there and they literally just start genociding Bangladeshi people. And interestingly, because Pakistan was an ally of the United States, as these refugees are pouring into India and India is pleading to the world, we need to go in and stop this genocide from happening, partly for our own stability, the United States sent a fleet, an aircraft carrier, to the Bay of Bengal to say, if you do anything, India, we will nuke you. India didn't have nuclear weapons back then. Fortunately, the Soviets sent a nuclear-capable fleet also to the Bay of Bengal to allow India to stop the genocide in Bangladesh. Again, not out of any goodness of their hearts or anything, but out of realpolitik. But it is important to mention the US and West Pakistan supported a genocide against Bangladeshi people, and India and the Soviets stopped it. Not only against the US, but the Chinese also would have been unhappy about an Indian victory in Bangladesh, or a Bangladeshi independence, because it weakens Pakistan and it strengthens India. And so to deter China, the USSR moved 40 divisions of troops to the Chinese border to say, if you invade India, we invade you. Huge amount of backing to allow India to actually exercise power in its neighborhood. This is something India can't do anymore. India doesn't exercise power in its own neighborhood, partly because there's no counterbalancing superpower, and because the United States and China will prevent India from doing that. It's also in 1971 when India and the Soviets sign a treaty of friendship. Now, India doesn't do alliances even to this day, and even back then, India was the head of the non-aligned movement, which wanted to stay out of great power politics, stay out of the Cold War. We just want to develop our own people. But having, had Pakistan as a US ally for 15 years, and then the US literally supporting a genocide on India's doorstep, was a line too far, and India signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviets. All right, then the Soviet Union collapses, unfortunately. And India has a currency crisis, and both the Indians and the Russians then warm up to the United States. There's a weird period between 1991 and 2000 when Russia scraps some deals with India to get on the US's good side. These are weapons deals. India was pissed about that. This is when Russia was governed by Boris Yeltsin. But very quickly, the Russians realized that the US and the West are not interested in being their friends, right? I think they had applied to join NATO, and the West said no. And they said, oh, okay. So even though we allowed the Soviet Union to collapse, because Gorbachev was at the very least a catalyst for this whole thing happening, if not having caused it by being so lax, even though this happened, the West still thinks of us as the enemy. That's the only reason they wouldn't let us join NATO. And there are actually some interesting conversations you can read that are now declassified between Putin and various American presidents, where Putin says, can we join NATO? He speaks about Pakistan as well. He says, we're worried about the Pakistanis getting nukes. But the Americans turned a blind eye to that as well. So by the year 2000, roughly 2000, Putin comes back to power. He thinks in terms of long-term geopolitics, and the relationship between India and Russia becomes close again. Let's talk about this defense relationship. During Soviet times, India was dependent on the Soviets for 80% of its defense imports. Now, in recent years, it's dropped to 36% as India aligns more closely with the West, but Russia is still, if I'm not mistaken, the largest supplier. Not only does Russia supply weapons, but it allows for a level of technology transfer that currently no other power does. Here are some examples. India and Russia work on the joint venture BrahMos missile, the world's fastest supersonic cruise missile. It has a range of a few hundred kilometers, and you should check out some videos of these missiles just eliminating ships in test runs. They also manufacture the Su-30 MKI jets in India, and they're heavily modified in India. India uses Israeli, French, and Indian systems in these jets, and this is an exception Russia has only made for India for these Su-30 jets. India also has 1,000 T-90 tanks designed in Russia, just like the jets, but made in India, in Tamil Nadu. So this is a relationship with very deep technology transfer links and very deep dependency. And even though Russia is only responsible now for 36%, going down to 30% of Indian imports, India's existing fleet of tanks, planes, etc., are serviced by the Russians, and this is still more than 50%. And they're also working on an AK-203 deal where entirely manufactured in India, AK-203s will equip the Indian army. 600,000 of these weapons, and they've already delivered 53,000. Russia is India's top oil supplier, still more than 30% market share. Russia is responsible for 1/3 of India's imported fertilizers. And in this particular fertilizer type, NPK fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, 92.8% of India's imports come from Russia. So again, even though the Soviet Union collapsed, this is a relationship with still deep dependencies in very critical areas, right? These fertilizers are used for India to grow food. So food security, energy security via oil, these are not trivial things that you can just brush off. Then we have the INSTC. So remember how Russia during Tsarist times and Soviet times was trying to push south? The Tsarists played the great game. The Soviets literally invaded Afghanistan in 1979, which India was very pissed about. And that also accelerated their collapse. Now they're doing what I think is a much more realistic game plan. They're just trading. And they're trying to build an infrastructure corridor from Russia through Iran and to India, to Bombay specifically. This is something that's supposed to be ready by the end of this year, 2026. The problem with that, as you can imagine, is that the central node of this connection has to go through Iran. And Iran is currently surrounded by the US Navy, and they're going for regime change. They're going for maybe collapsing Iran as a country. And if that happens, you can kiss the INSTC goodbye. Let's see what happens with the INSTC. But if it happens, it will mean that Russia and India will have a connection through Iran, right? And they'll send goods to each other this way, and trade might increase as well. Speaking of trade increasing, since the Ukraine war, which I should stress, India is not happy about this war because it makes everything about the India-Russia relationship worse, right? It makes India's relationship with the West more complicated, which India doesn't want. It makes Russia more dependent on China, which India doesn't want. It makes the Russian economy weaker, so Russia can be a less dependable partner for India, which also India doesn't want. So everything about Russia's war in Ukraine, not to mention the huge humanitarian cost, is something that India doesn't want to happen. The fact that India still trades with Russia despite the war is because India still trades with many crazy, violent countries around the world, even though they're up to terrible things. The US has done many terrible operations of war around the world. It's not like everybody stops trading with them, right? This whole stop trading with someone because they're doing something in their neighborhood is a very Western maximalist concept, you could say. But despite that, now that Russia is out of the Western system, India and Russia are looking for ways to continue to trade, to continue to maintain their strong bond despite this. So they're trading in rupees and rubles, and unfortunately, Russia doesn't buy enough from India, so they're storing up a lot of rupees in India, while India buys a lot from Russia, the oil, the fertilizers we mentioned, defense equipment. And Russia is reinvesting its rupees into Indian infrastructure, so they can get some return on investment from that as well. Now, part of Putin's visit to India in December 2025 was about increasing India-Russia trade. One route for this will be the INSTC. The other route will be the India, I think it's called the Chennai-Vladivostok Maritime Corridor. I forget the exact name, but this is a maritime route that goes from India through the Strait of Malacca and eventually up to Vladivostok in Russia. This one is, in my opinion, less important because most of the Russian people live in the West, not in Eastern Russia. But it's another route, regardless. And Russia, even today, despite its increasing dependence on China, continues to serve as a neutral ground between India and China whenever things flare up, right? Because in the Russian interest, everyone should work together so that they can still be friends with Russia, and Russia can do its geopolitical ambitions in Europe and against America. They don't like when India and China fight. But when India and China do fight, the Russians understand that the Chinese, who they have a large land border with, have a huge advantage on them in terms of economy and weight. Many Chinese citizens claim parts of Russia that Russia once took from a Chinese empire ages ago. And China is also competing with Russia for the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes through Central Asia. And so, and India is, by the way, not active at all or barely active in Central Asia at all because it has no route to get there per se. And so whenever India and China have a conflict, it is in the Russian interest to support India against China, to balance things out, right? Because Russia plus India together, they can kind of hold their ground. Them alone, they can't do that anymore. Now the problem is that as we go into the future, the Russian balancing element versus the Chinese is fading. Because as they get more involved in Ukraine, China is willing to skirt sanctions, is willing to ignore sanctions and continue trading with Iran, Venezuela, Russia in huge quantities. The Russians actually buy things from China, manufactured goods, which they don't buy from India. And so India is seeing the writing on the wall. Even though there's this friendly relation, and you see when Putin comes to India, he's treated like a celebrity. India sees that in the coming decades, Russia could become entirely dependent on China simply out of necessity, as it's cut out of the Western system, which is one of the reasons India doesn't want these sanctions on Russia. It doesn't want to stop trading with Russia, because what that means is you're giving Russia to the Chinese. But if this is the way things are happening, India is also hedging its bets. It's tilting west, this is clear. The EU President Ursula von der Leyen was the chief guest at India's Republic Day, a month after Putin's visit. India signed a free trade agreement with the EU. It's going to start jointly manufacturing defense equipment with the EU the way it does with Russia. And it seems very clear that in order to balance China, India is connecting with the West. And this is naturally going to mean that the India-Russia relationship is going to get weaker over time. So as we go into the future, what you're going to see is, how do I put this? You know how you have a best friend who when you meet them, it's like you met yesterday, right? And you get along just fine. And you're going to see this with India-Russia relations. When they do meet, it's going to be very friendly. But just like if you and your friend move to different cities and you kind of fall out of touch, the Indian and Russian geopolitical space, strategic space, is moving in slightly different directions going into the future. And so you're going to continue to see friendly relations. I would be quite surprised if they become hostile in any way, though I wouldn't put it out of the picture, especially if China comes into the question. But you're going to see India and Russia gradually move in different directions, and while still important to each other, the level of importance is going to come down over the next few years as Russia moves closer to China and India moves closer to the West. And I hope that helps answer the question of why India is so close to Russia. There's many, many, many layers to this pizza, as I covered here. There's even more that I didn't go into detail on. But over the next decades, things are going to slightly change. It's been interesting. Thanks for checking this video out. Like and subscribe, share with your friends, and let me know in the comments if you like this format and you'd like to see more of these kinds of videos. See you next time.